Welcome to the 8th annual Thousand Oaks Reads One City, One Book author event. I'm Nancy Schramm, Interim Library Services Director at the Thousand Oaks Library. Thousand Oaks Reads One City, One Book is a citywide literary event encouraging community members to read and discuss the same book. Thank you to all of you for your ongoing support of the Thousand Oaks Library and your participation in the One City, One Book program. As the One City, One Book motto says, when we open a book together, we close it in greater harmony. Now, please welcome City of Thousand Oaks Council Member Jackie Irwin.
For 8 years now, the library staff and volunteers have organized and presented this unique community program, one that brings people together to share their experience over a common book. Thousands of readers, including myself, embrace the selected One City title each year and look forward to the programs and discussions created to enrich and enhance the author's work. And this afternoon, as we greet our celebrated author, it's an appropriate time to reflect on the purpose, value, and importance of the Thousand Oaks Library to our vibrant and engaged community. We observed the 50th anniversary of the city this autumn, and it's an honor for me to take this opportunity to recognize the Thousand Oaks Library's impact on all of us. As a home for best-selling books, compelling films, online databases, informational resources and programs, and access to computers and the internet, our library is a difficult act to follow. As a destination, the building itself has developed into a bustling center of the community, anchored by an energetic, creative staff serving the needs of all our residents. From engaging baby story times, to high school students working on projects, to people searching for jobs, our senior citizens navigating their way through social media and email. There's a year-round steady drumbeat of programs and concerts, speakers and entertainers, films and workshops. Part of the library's mission is to help people find something good to read. And that is what brings us all here today. Mary Coyne, impeccably crafted by author Marissa SIlver, feeds our city's hunger for excellent writing, for characters that feel alive, and for the exploration of issues that help us understand the ongoing challenges in the world. One City, One Book confirms the importance of literature in our everyday life and brings us together as a satisfying connection, because when we open a book together, we close it in greater harmony. Enjoy the author. Thank you all for coming today, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Council Member Irwin. The 2014 Thousand Oaks Reads One City, One Book selection is Mary Coyne by Marissa SIlver. Mary Coyne is a work of fiction centered on one of the most compelling photographs in American history, Dorothea Lange's migrant mother. In 1936, a young mother resting by the side of a dusty road in Central California is spontaneously photographed by a woman documenting the lives of migrant farm laborers. Little personal information is exchanged, and neither woman realizes yet that they have created what will become the most iconic image of the Great Depression. 3 vibrant characters anchor the narrative of Mary Coyne. Mary is the migrant mother, an impoverished woman with deep reserves of courage and nerve, private passions and carefully guarded secrets. Vera Dare, the ambitious photographer making wrenching personal choices in order to pursue her work, and Walker Dodge, a present-day professor of cultural history, who discovers a family mystery embedded in the legendary image of Mary Coyne. Writing in luminously rendered prose, Silver creates an extraordinary tale from a brief moment in history and reminds us that although a great photograph can capture the essence of a moment, it only scratches the surface of life. And now, please join me in welcoming to the stage Los Angeles Times book critic and former book editor, David Ulin.
Thank you. And welcome. Glad to see all of you here. So I'm going to be very brief right now and just introduce Marissa quickly. And then she's going to come out and read a little bit and talk a little bit, and then she and I are going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to ask you guys for questions so you can talk a little bit, and that's what we're going to do. But I just want to say quickly, it's a real pleasure for me to be here because Marissa is not just a writer I admire, but also a good friend of mine, and in fact is representative of my favorite category of friend, which is people who I became friendly with because I like their writing so much. I think that she's a really sort of deft and sharp observer, both of contemporary life, if you've read her short stories, and they're the sort of, I want to call them slices of contemporary life in Los Angeles, Southern California, the way parents interact with children, the way families configure and break apart are really profound and sharp. And in her novels, No Direction Home, The God of War, and this novel, Mary Coyne, which both, some of them deal with contemporary life, and this novel, which is historical in its way, although there is also a contemporary element to it. There's a real sense of the depths of how people come together and come apart. A very strong story-making quality as well, but for me the real draw are the insights and the sort of interiority and the kind of the nuances and complexity of the characters and their emotional situations. I find the most compelling literature to be the literature that deals on some level with our universality, our sense of human connection, the way that we connect across generations to other people, the issues and concerns we share, and I think that's a hallmark of Marissa's writing. So I'm going to bring her out. I was told I should summon her, so I'm going to summon her. Marissa, will you come out? So Marissa SIlver. And I'm going to disappear for a moment and yield the stage. So thank you and enjoy the program.
Hi. Thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to be here, and it's such an honor to have been, for this novel to have been chosen as your city read. That's a pretty remarkable thing, and I'm really, really gratified by it and gratified to see all of you here. I think that what I'm going to start out by doing is just read you a couple of pages, because long readings are boring. I don't want to bore you, but I want to give you a little flavor of the book. I know some of you have read it, maybe some of you haven't, so this will just be a little bit. I'm going to read a little bit from the point of view of Vera Dare, the photographer, when she's an older woman. So this happens about a little past halfway through the book, and it's the beginning of her introduction as an older woman, and she's at the very end of her life. She's quite sick, and she's about to meet her maker, but this happens right before that. In the living room, she searched for the photo. She never liked to display her work. There was something unseemly about doing such a thing, like leaving your drying brassiere hanging on the shower rod for guests to see. She finally found it among a group of framed pictures stacked upright against a wall. As she brushed the dust off the glass with the sleeve of her nightgown, she remembered how excited Miller and Philip, her sons, became whenever she or Everett pulled into a filling station on the long trips to and from Taos. The boys stopped fighting while they watched the attendant scrape away road dust and bird droppings from the windshield with his rubber-edged tool. She could still picture their amazed expressions, as if they were watching a more sharply brilliant world reveal itself to them through the windshield. That was the thing about looking through frames. You saw something you had seen before, maybe hundreds of times, but you noticed it differently. She set the picture against the wall and sat opposite it. The photograph embarrassed her. It was not that she didn't think it was a good image. It was. She had made plenty of poor ones in her career, and she knew the difference. She'd found the right distance between herself and her subject this time. She got just close enough to the woman and her children so that she had not forced a point of view by being too aggressive an angle or by including ironic juxtapositions. The picture had been effective because it was an us-them proposition. Every single person who looked at the photograph had to decide whose side he was on. But over time, it had been so reproduced, so co-opted, so burdened with the obligation to represent an entire era, that it had become something both more and less than the image she had taken that day. It reminded her of an over-decorated soldier who looks less like a hero and more like a little boy playing dress-up. Sometimes when she came across the image in a book or an article, she averted her eyes. Like the woman in the picture, why did she suddenly, at that last moment, turn her gaze away from the camera? Often, people Vera photographed asked her how she wanted them to look or stand. Should they comb their hair or put on another dress? She told them they should do whatever made them feel comfortable. As much as she liked a photo that captured some unconscious moment, she also appreciated the formality of the pose. Maybe this was the effect of all her years working in the studio. People talked about the truth as being something you had to steal when the subject was unaware. The phrase was, after all, taking a picture. But the truth was as much in the way a woman arranged her hair or rubbed a stain off her child's chin before allowing the picture to be taken. The truth was often a performance of the idea of truth. Why did the woman look away? The question was vexing. Maybe she had lost her nerve and this turning away was a willful disappearance, the way a child covers his eyes and believes no one can see him. Perhaps she thought Vera pitied her. Vera hoped that wasn't the case. Pity was a horrible thing. Vera remembered the looks of women she hobbled past on the streets of New York when she was a girl. Their mock tender smiles masking the relief that their children were not polios like her. Where was the father? Oh yes, she remembered. He was gone, repairing the car. She wondered if she would have photographed the family had he been there. Maybe it had been his absence that attracted her. A family minus a father was an unbalanced proposition that the eye always wanted to correct. Perhaps she had been drawn to the fact of their waiting because she knew so well that aching experience when time stretched and slowed, where your sense of purpose dissolved and everything was directed towards, when will he return? What if he doesn't? She told the woman what she was about, and the woman agreed to have her picture taken. Vera started at a distance, maybe 30 feet from the tent. The older girl sat at an angle to the rocking chair, leaning against its back, her head resting in her arms. She looked as if she were daydreaming, and maybe she was. It was a lovely pose, charged with some idea the girl had of herself that was so touching to Vera, which is why she had decided to frame the girl out of the following shots. It was her instinct to move away from easy sentiment. The mother sat inside the tent with the baby and the two small children. Vera took a picture of the woman as she nursed her child, the skin of her breast, the stretch of it like a pale rise in the landscape. Vera took a few more shots. Then she asked the two little ones to stand on either side of their mother and turn around. Why had she done that? It was not her habit to arrange people. Something about their faces had bothered her. So many children she photographed were uncannily wise, their youthful whimsy snuffed out by hard knowledge. But these two were still open-hearted, and they were so attached to their mother, so certain she would protect them from this stranger with a camera. Their smooth, thoughtful expressions, their mussed hair. Vera thought of her boys when they woke from sleep, their wayward looks, their expressions still distracted by dreams. She was abruptly gripped by the certainty that she needed to see Miller and Philip as soon as possible. The feeling descended on her with the full force of an emergency, as if her boys were in distress and she had to get to them right away. That's right, just turn around, she encouraged when the children were slow to respond to her request. But even when they faced away, she could still see their innocent expressions. She took the final photograph, packed up the Graflex and the tripod, and left. Thanks. Thank you so much. So I just want to tell you a little bit about how this book came to be. I'm sure that, well, as I'm sure many of you had seen this photograph so often in my life. from childhood, really, because I think it was always in the history books whenever the Depression was discussed. It's sort of the image of the Depression. So, when we learned about it in the 5th grade or whatever grade we started learning about those things in, there was that image. And it's an incredibly arresting image for reasons that maybe we'll talk about a little bit later. And it had always intrigued me. I don't know why particularly more than another photograph, but it had. And, but about 4 years ago, I was at a museum in Manhattan, in New York, the Modern Art Museum, and there was a photograph about photographs of the West. And because I live out here, I'm always interested in anything about the West, so I went. And it was a sort of a range of photographs from many different decades. And among the photographs was hanging the famous Dorothea Lange image, Migrant Mother. And I walked over to it again, sort of once again allured by the woman's face, which is quite beautiful, I think. But what really got me this time was the information that the curator had placed next to the photograph, which said that the woman in the photograph had not revealed her identity until she was sick and dying and needed money for her health care. And that piece of information was so, it like hit me like an anvil. It was so powerful. I thought, what must her relationship have been to that photograph for her not to have said, I'm the woman in that famous photograph? I mean, it's arguably one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century, certainly in America. And yet she had never said, I'm the one. And especially, I guess it was especially, funny in this day and age where people are laying claim to everything, for the world of the Kardashians. But, so here was a woman who literally was famous and never said, never wanted to say, I'm that person. She did not claim her celebrity. So it was really sort of an idea, unlike most things that I've ever written, that just kind of descended on me all at once, because I just thought there is a really powerful story to tell there about someone who is an icon, a sort of reluctant icon, clearly. I didn't know the source of her reluctance. I didn't even know if it was real because, I don't know anything about that woman. But in my mind, suddenly, in my fiction writer's mind, a story began to emerge. What I did initially was I tracked down as much of the real information as I could. And obviously, Dorothea Lange, the photographer, is an enormously famous figure in 20th century art, and so much has been written about her. There are wonderful biographies about her, which I poured through. She's referenced in almost any, work about 20th century photography, and she's been interviewed quite a bit and talked about this photograph. Obviously, it's the photograph everyone wants to ask her about. She even has had, filmed interviews, so I was able to watch her on film and sort of get a sense of what her, her spirit was and the way she held herself physically. So I did an enormous amount of research about her, and I used tons of the sort of real facts of her life. She did have childhood polio. She did grow up in New Jersey, and then she moved out west on her own at, I think she was 20. She did become a society photographer, and then over time, when the Depression hit, and because of all sorts of different circumstances in her life, began to photograph the migrant farmers in California. So her biography was sort of ripe for a fiction writer because, whenever I sort of didn't know where to go, I would just turn to her biography and say, oh, and then she did that. And so then I would create, a fictional world around that. And I embroidered an enormous amount, and I created scenes that never existed, and I created things that never happened to Dorothea Lange. My intention was not to write the story of Dorothea Lange, but to create a character sort of inspired by her. But there's almost nothing to know about the woman in the photograph, whose name is Florence Owens Thompson. And everything that I found, you could find by Googling her. No one's ever written a biography about her. No one's ever made a movie about her. No one's ever, some random articles have been written about her. Some of her relatives have spoken about her and some of that stuff that you can find. But there's sort of no kind of document of her life. So, but what I found in the research that I was able to do was really compelling to me. She grew up in eastern Oklahoma. She was either half or whole Cherokee. A lot of this information was kind of unsubstantiated, so there was no way to know, is she half or is she, fully, or, all those sorts of things. She did come out to California with her first husband, not during the Dust Bowl, which was sort of a bummer because then I couldn't write about the Dust Bowl, which is a wonderful thing to sort of research and think about how to use as fiction. It's an incredibly powerful situation. She came out before that, worked in the sawmills, or her husband did, in Northern California, and then over time became a migrant farm worker. So with that little bit of information, I just sort of took off as a fiction writer and allowed my fictional imagination to run wild and created the story of what might have been the story of these two women. And into that, I added this third character that was mentioned earlier, a historian named Walker Dodge, who sort of has a relationship to the photograph that he isn't aware of until he begins to, through a series of instances, research it. And in a funny way, even though he's sort of the least, he's an invented character, so nobody would have known him before I wrote it, he was kind of he sort of funneled a lot of my interest, because I think in some ways my interest in this book was not only about these two women and this strange moment of connection that they had and the repercussions of that moment, but it's also about history and about how we understand history over time. And my personal feelings that it's very much of an interpretive act, our understanding of what happened to us in the past. We know certain facts and figures. We won't know when treaties were struck and when wars were waged and all sorts of things like that. But there's a lot that we don't know, and that we kind of fill in the blanks in terms of history, and that we also look at through the filter of our own modern perspective, which may or may not have been what was going on in that point in time. And that really interests me. It interests me to think about how we reinterpret history and how we come to understand it, and what we base our idea of our lives on, and that it may or may not be accurate, but it's sort of accurate in the way that we need it to be. And that really is something that I'm very drawn to. And so I think that the character of Walker, being a social historian, someone who sort of is less interested in the facts and figures and in the kind of interstitial stuff of everyday life as a way to understand history, was a great way for me to explore that avenue of interest that drew me to want to write this book. So that was sort of the conception for the book. And then, 3.5 years later, there's always this moment, and every writer will tell you, where you sort of suddenly see your book, and then you have to write it. And the difference between what you saw, this perfect chrysalis of an object, and the differential between that and what you end up coming out with at the other end, can sometimes be somewhat disheartening, even if what you've produced is something that you're happy with, because in your mind's eye, it's sort of this perfect object, and then you have to bring your talents to bear on it, and your struggles and your challenges. So that is the stuff of writing. One of the really fascinating things for me when I wrote this book was trying to understand why I wrote this book. And I think that's part of a process for me with everything that I write, that I tend not to start writing really knowing very much. I don't know necessarily the whole story that I want to tell. I don't know why I'm telling it. I'm sort of following some compulsions and allowing myself to trust that because these things interest me, that there might be some powerful thing there that I can explore. And when I started this book, of course, I knew that there was this story of these two women, and these things happened to them, and they met at this moment on a roadside, and then their lives went off in different directions. But it wasn't until really deep into the writing that I began to understand why Marissa SIlver wanted to write this story. And part of it, I think, came back to something that was in my life, which is that when I first started in my work life, I was a filmmaker. And I had left school to make a documentary film for public television, PBS. And it was a film that I made with another director, and it was about a group of fundamental Christians living in Muncie, Indiana. And we went out to Indiana, and we met this family, and we sort of ended up living with this family and filming them and being quite intimate with them. And one of the things that I remember really strongly about that experience was the sense of ethical the ethical problem of the project, which was that, we befriended this family, and we were honest with them, I think, and we were respectful of them, and we tried to just present them as we saw them, not with much, kind of, as it says in this passage that I read, irony. But there's a very strange contract that exists between an artist and a subject in that way, in that, we were there to make a piece of art about their lives, and they agreed to it, but they did not. I don't think that anybody can understand what it means to be exposed in that way. And this film showed on public television, so it showed to hundreds of thousands of people. And I wouldn't be able to understand what that meant. If somebody said to me, I'm gonna make a film of you, and it's too big, and you don't understand what that feels like to be exposed in that way. So I think that I felt, as much as that we were trying to be very honorable with these people, I even then at my young age, I understood that there was sort of you couldn't really be 100% honorable because our aims were different. I don't really know why they agreed to be in the film. I know why we wanted them to be in the film, and I know that every edit that we made and every camera angle that we chose shifted the way that story was told, and that there was no truth in the sense that there was no kind of totally objective truth. And so when I was writing this story and I was thinking about what it would have meant to be at that crossroads where, my character Mary Coyne met Vera Dare, or where Dorothea Lange met Florence Owens Thompson, I really understood deeply the complications of that moment from this experience that I had as a young woman. And that really was powerful to me, because I think that it's something that all writers have to come to grips with when they're writing, because inevitably you're using stuff from your life, whether or not you're dressing it up or you're not dressing it up. You're using life around you, and it's something, and to greater or lesser degrees. And some people write about their mother, or some people write about characters, but they use stuff from what they see around them, an interaction they've had with a friend. So there's always this complicated ethic involved in making art. And I think that was something that was, many years later, after I'd made that film, 30 years later, I was sort of able to work through in a way that I hadn't when I was younger. And I think it made me feel, a lot of times people say, which character do you most relate to? And I think I relate to all of them in different ways, but I certainly relate to the photographer character for that reason, because I think that that choice to use people to make art, even if your intention is to, as Dorothea Lange's was, and as Vera Dare in the book is to sort of expose a social situation and hopefully, cause governments to change their behaviors. It's a funny contract. It's a funny ethical choice. And it was a really interesting to me as a older woman to go back and sort of explore some of the complications of something that had happened to me when I was young. So that's what the story of Mary Coyne has been, and it's been a very wonderful and satisfying book to put out there because it was so nicely embraced. I think also because it came at a time, right in the middle of the Great Recession. And it was interesting, I think, for a lot of people to sort of think about, what was referenced always in the recession was the Great Depression. And so I think it was sort of a chance for people to begin to think about, well, what was that like back then? And what is the difference between what we're going through now and what was going on then? A lot of people, of course, now didn't live through the Depression, and even their parents didn't. So it was a chance to sort of reference a time in American history that had that we were living through to some degree, in a much lesser way, but for some people just as powerful a way now. So it was a really satisfying experience both to write the book and to have it come out and be embraced by people for all sorts of different reasons. And now he's creeping out again. He said he would come, and he did. So thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here.
So Let's talk a little bit about the relationship of history and fiction.
Okay.
Because that was, you know, just in terms of thinking about this book is a departure for you in the sense that it's the first book you've written that doesn't, you know, that goes back into history. And also it is dealing, as I know you were talking about, it's dealing with an iconic image, an iconic moment in terms of the Depression, and that image as a sort of signifier in some way. So what were the challenges in terms of, you know, and there is a modern storyline in this book as well. So what were the challenges in terms of going back?
You know, for me, the challenge, it was a kind of weirdly personal challenge, and maybe again came from my experience as a young filmmaker, but for a long, long time, I felt very uncomfortable about taking something that actually happened and taking two women's lives that actually were lived and using them in that way, and using them and sort of, and you know, plenty of writers have done it. I mean, you all, I'm sure, have read, you know, many, many historical novels where people freely and without changing names or anything use these characters. So it's not like I was inventing the wheel, God knows. But for me, I think because I don't know why, but I really had a hard time giving myself permission to say, okay, I can invent upon lives that were lived, and that it's okay to do that. And, you know, in the beginning, I used their real names. I was writing about Dorothea and Florence. And it wasn't until I decided to change their names that I really was able to let myself go. And I think and in a funny way, at the same time that I made that choice to do that, I also put the picture aside. I had been looking at the picture, of course, endlessly. And then at a certain point, I had to put it aside, and I had to stop looking at pictures of Dorothea Lange and stop looking at that picture of Florence Owens Thompson, and really allow myself just to go off into a purely fictional universe, and know that that was a legitimate thing to do, which it is. I mean, it's such a non-problem, but it was a big stumbling block for me. I think particularly because, you know, what makes in my mind, what makes a novel sing ultimately is not the facts that are being recounted, but it's the emotional lives that are being recounted. And I felt in some ways hampered by not having access. I don't know what Dorothea Lange thought about anything. I don't know what Florence Owens Thompson thought or felt about anything. But I needed to know those things about my characters in order to write a novel that would have any kind of resonance for readers. So it wasn't until I was really able to sort of turn my back on the real characters and begin to really invent their deep emotional lives, free of worry about, well, maybe Dorothea Lange didn't feel that way, or maybe, you know, that I was really able to sort of turn it into fiction. So it was kind of this weird, had to cross over some invisible line for myself, and when I was able to do that, then I kind of, and the funny thing is, you know, the book is clearly about two women who lived in, and obviously the cover of the book, there's no subterfuge going on. And yet I don't think readers think, oh, this is the story of Dorothea Lange and Florence Owens Thompson. So it's this interesting kind of weird, it's like the space after you wake up from a dream, but you're not quite awake yet. It's that weird middle space that I think historical fiction can occupy, where you're taking something that really happened, but you're not addressing it as truth. You're addressing it as something, an invention.
Well, or you're addressing it as emotional truth. I think it's right. I think the word is liminal, although I have no idea.
I was going to use that word, but then I was embarrassed.
I kind of like that word. I like that word, although I have no real understanding of what it means.
It's the middle part.
Yeah. So, but anyway, but it is. You're not writing the story of Dorothea Lange and Florence Owens Thompson. You're writing the story of these other people who it would. You know, I agree. The photo makes it clear. It would be a subterfuge to suggest that they have nothing to do with that, or they weren't inspired by that. But there's something alchemical,
yes.
alchemical, whatever it is, right?
Liminal and alchemical.
Yeah, and alchemy occurs, right, in the process of writing the story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's when I think, as a writer, and you certainly know this, it's when you sort of feel like, okay, I'm onto something. When you're kind of in that weird new world of where something. It is like chemistry. It's like you pour one thing together, another thing together, and suddenly what bubbles up is something that never existed before, and that's what fiction can be.
Right. Just out of curiosity, because I don't think I've ever heard you talk about that idea of writing using their real names at first. Were you thinking about it as fiction at that point, or is it just at that point it's too early? You're just sort of getting stuff on paper and kind of mapping out what the book might look like?
I think I always knew it was fiction. I'm not a nonfiction writer, and I never had an intention to write the lives of those characters, mostly because I don't know what they thought or felt, so how could I write their lives? But I think it was just this weird process where I sort of had to make this transition for myself between thinking about the real people and then thinking about my characters. And honestly, when I think of Mary Coyne, I don't think of that woman's face. I don't probably think of any face. I don't tend to sort of know what my characters look like. When I think of Vera Dare, I don't think of Dorothea Lange. So I think that it was sort of a process for me where I just had to invent characters, and which happens in all fiction. I mean, you start out in a very, when you start writing fictional characters, you don't know very much about them. You sort of know them through your writing. So you start out with very shreddy kind of information. You might know whether they have short hair or long hair, or I should speak about me. Other people may do it differently. And then through writing scenes, through putting them in situations and giving them behavior and giving them reaction and giving them language, and then you begin to sense, who are they? What kind of person are they? Are they warm or cold? Are they guarded or are they not? Are they, are they abrupt? Or all those sorts of things you learn through this experience of getting to know them like you would get to know another human being. It's actually not all that different.
Right, and also I think they have to exist. I'll admit, when I read the novel, I knew very little about, I knew nothing about Florence Owens Thompson except for the fact that was her and her family in that photograph. I knew nothing about her life before the photograph was taken or her life in the years after the photograph. I knew very little about Dorothea Lange except for the fact that, I knew her name and I knew that she had taken Depression-era photos. I wouldn't recognize her if I looked at a photograph of her right now. So for me as a reader, I have to be able to create those characters in my head based on what's in the book. I have to be able to imagine them and visualize them outside of that historical record, or else it doesn't make any difference.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in a way, I'm sort of glad that there wasn't a lot to know about Florence Thompson, because then I wasn't really hampered by those facts. I could just invent her. And there may be, usually, most fiction writers will tell you that when you write characters, there's always someone will come up to you and they'll tell you that happened. That there's this weird thing where you'll invent something, but you will have gotten to some truth, and you will have hit upon something that actually occurred to someone or something. So who knows? Maybe, if those certain things didn't happen to Florence Owens Thompson, they may have happened to some migrant farmers. I certainly got a lot of information through research about the migrant farming community, and one of the fun research things for me which I love to do, is I love going to small towns and going to the visitors center, and inevitably, or antique stores, or thrift shops. And what you find if you start trolling through stuff is, first of all, troves of photographs, which are such wonderful documents, and they're totally anonymous, and you always think about, wow, I'm sure whoever took this photograph didn't think that they were going to end up in this bin at the antique store, but there they are. But the other thing that you often find are these marvelous sort of self-published documents that people in the community have written for themselves, for their family, for their community. Very kind of, they're not professionally done. Some of them are hand-typed. Some of them are, stapled together. Sometimes they're a little bit more professional, but they're these incredible documents of whatever that person was talking about. And they are particularly great because they tend to have these wonderful, very personal details in them that a historian writing kind of the history would not put in. So, how my mother washed the clothes when we didn't have any soap. That kind of stuff, which for a fiction writer is like manna. What did we eat? What did we do for fun? One of the things that I think it's very easy to do when you think about the Depression and the migrant farmers, and you think, oh my God, this horrible life, and you see these pictures of the terrible situations at the camps and all that. But the truth is, when you read these kinds of documents, you find out that, like anything, there was joy, there was fun, there was love, there was games, there was dancing, all those sorts of things that helps you get away from making generalizations about a time that you didn't live in.
Yeah, and I think it's also, what is, E.M. Forster calls it the buzz of implication. There's a great Jane Smiley line about how if you want to read the history of Victorian England, you can read, or of London in the 19th century, you can read it. If you want to know what it was really like to walk the streets, read Dickens, or read Gogol if you want to find out what it was like to actually be in St. Petersburg in the 1830s. And so in some way, that is the role of fiction, to create the nitty-gritty world, not so much the big picture, or to sort of tell the big story through the small story in some way.
And to bring sort of an emotional truth to something that we might not have access to, recognizing that it's my idea, it's my emotional truth. But if you're, I think what makes us love the books that we love is that the truth feels real. It feels real, and it feels resonant to us in some deep way where we go, yeah, I get it. Even if I don't know if that's what it was like, or maybe it wasn't, I kind of get that maybe it wasn't exactly like that. I feel that this is what it was like, or what these people might have felt like. And that's, I think, why we love the books that we love.
Now, I want to ask you a little bit about the structure of the book, because it is three sort of interlocking narratives, which is, is one the contemporary narrative, and then the sort of two parallel historical narratives. Was that part of the process? Did you know that all along? Is that something that you kind of wrote your way to? At what point did Walker enter the story, or was he there all along?
He wasn't there. I knew from the get-go that I wanted to have not just the story of the two women. I didn't want it just to be the historical story of these two women. I wanted there to be a modern character, because I wanted, again, what I was speaking about before, I wanted to have some access to the idea of of history, and how do we understand history. And Walker came to me quite a bit into the process. I had all sorts of different versions of who that modern character was going to be. At one point, I think he was like the grandchild of one of the characters, or the great-grandson, or, I didn't know who that modern person was going to be. And then I sort of hit on Walker. I can't remember exactly. Oh, I know. I was looking at some social history, and there's a wonderful social historian named Michael Lessie.
Oh yeah, he's great.
Who wrote a book called Wisconsin Death Trip, which is a kind of an amazing document where he went to he went to Wisconsin, and I don't know where he went to, one particular town, and he looked through all the newspaper morgues and the antique store, does what my character does, and sort of reconstructed what life was like there during the Industrial Revolution, and constructed a very dark and disturbing picture of what life was like. So contrary to our idea that, the cities were horrible, cesspools of factories and child labor, and the agrarian life was wonderful, it's a very different point of view. And I was really struck by the kind of work that he does. And so I kind of created a character like someone like that, for whom history is about, the pictures and all the little nitty-gritty between the facts.
He also, obviously he connects to the bigger story, as we know, but he also provides us with a kind of contemporary lens to look at the other stories, since that is what he does. It sort of, it creates that movement in the book. His presence creates that movement in the book, that back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the structure, I knew, so there were always going to be three, and I also knew that, or didn't know, but as I was writing, I realized that once the women met for the photo, the famous moment of taking the photograph, I wasn't really interested in anything that happened after that until they were old ladies. And I don't know why, but I just thought, I'm done with that story now, and I only want to meet up with them once they're really old, and to see what the repercussions of this moment have been throughout their lives. So I had these portions of the book that were the characters from their girlhoods through the moment of taking the photograph, and then I had them as older ladies. And I kind of structured the book, differently as I went along. There were times when it was very short chapters that intersected, but then I realized I wanted to sort of be in these women's lives for longer, and so finally the structure sort of found itself. Lots of me sitting on the ground with note cards, stretched, but all books sort of come together in their own way, and that's how it came together.
I want to go back to that idea of not being, sort of once the picture gets taken, that period is over. Because I think the other thing, I mean, that picture in its way has become a kind of iconic fiction, you know? If you look at photographs of Florence Owens Thompson later in her life, you know, there's a great family photo.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
That was taken in the yard, and, you know, it's her and all the kids, and, you know, she's wearing sort of, it must have been taken in the 80s, right? And she's got, you know, like big hair, and she's wearing stretch pants, and it's, you know, it's kind of a great picture, but it's also sort of the antithesis of that iconic picture because she looks like anyone,
Well,
right?
not only that, but I mean, it's interesting that you bring that up because one of the things that really struck me when I started to research was I found that picture because it was, what happened was that the family exposed who she was because she needed money for her health care. She was sick, she had cancer. And then an intrepid reporter from the Sacramento Bee came out and he took this picture and he kind of posed it like the old picture. He had her sitting in like a lawn chair and she had two of her adult daughters on either side of her. And they're like these really robust, strong-looking women, and they all, you know, they clearly got their hair set, and, you know, it's sort of a marvelous picture. But what struck me about it was how fantastic they looked.
Yeah.
And that it was, to me, it was like a picture of survival in this funny way, even though she was quite ill. These were people who had come from the photograph that we all saw from the 30s to here. And look at them, they were fantastic. They looked strong and healthy, and, you know, they were living in she was living, I think, in a trailer home, but, you know, they were not impoverished, far from it. And I thought, wow, you know what, these people survived. And that was a really powerful thing for me to think about, well, how am I gonna tell that story of survival? Because to me, it wasn't a story about a victim, it was a story of a survivor. And you know, when we talk about that photograph, we've talked about this before, it's like, why is it so iconic? And, you know, one of the reasons, many reasons, one of which is that her face is sort of both resigned and incredibly powerful. And I think when you look at that photograph, you don't see a woman, you see two things. You see a woman who's sort of at maybe the lowest point in her life, but you also see a woman who you think has incredible fight left in her. And the way her children are sort of crowded around her, you can tell that they rely on her and that she's, I mean, I'm reading into it, but that's what we all do. You know, she's gonna figure it out. She's gonna survive because she's gotta take care of all these kids. And so the contrast of those two photographs was really powerful to me. The other reason I think that the photograph is so powerful is because, you know, it really, in terms of its composition, it's very much like the pictures of Mother Mary holding infant Jesus with the two angels on either side. And I think that that's an image that is ingrained in us. You know, we have seen it so often in so many pieces of art, in so many churches, and so it's sort of part of our DNA almost. And so when we see that photograph, I think we respond to it in the way that we respond to a face, you know, that we're familiar with, that there's something very familiar about that photograph.
And I have to assume that that was at least partly intentional. I mean, Lange is an intentional artist. I think that's the other thing too, is like that photo was made as well as taken or shot, right? I mean, it was composed, it was framed. There are, 6 or 7 other photos in the sequence, so that one was the image that she selected. So in that same way that the photo sort of freezes the moment, but it also kind of shapes or frames the moment, it is, I don't mean a fiction in the sense that we should disregard it, but a fiction in the sense of it being a kind of piece of heightened reality, which is one of the things I think good fiction does, is sort of heighten reality.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she did turn those children around, and she did choose to frame out the older daughter. If you go on Google, you can find all the other photographs that she took that day. And who knows how, you know, I think, who knows how intentional it was at the moment. You know, I would probably guess that it wasn't, that she didn't say to herself, oh, this looks like Mother Mary. I don't think so at all. I think probably in her DNA, there was something, and she made that choice in the moment. It's such an interesting choice why she didn't want to see those children's faces. And it's hard to imagine the picture would have been as powerful had we seen their faces. I think we would have focused more on the children than on the mother, and there would have been so much information. There's something about not seeing their faces that you know, sometimes not knowing information compels us even further, and not seeing their faces, I think, is so utterly compelling. But yes, it is artificial, and I think that any photograph is artificial, as is any piece of fiction, because the person making it is making discrete choices about composition, how far away she was from the subject, what did she frame out, what did she keep in, and all of those choices changed the way we view the photograph. And so, there's no part of me that believes that there is a truthful photograph. Right. I think it's all an interplay between the subject and the photographer.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I also think that, one of the advantages, again, intentional or otherwise, and I agree with you, is probably intuitive, of turning the kids away, is that it does become, it is called Migrant Mother. It becomes a portrait of motherhood or parenthood. And, from my own experience as a parent, the kind of combination of worry and perseverance, that seems to sum up what parenthood is all about. So it becomes a sort of universal, regardless of the situation. And that's the other thing, too, is I think it can't just be a document of that moment. It has to have those universal applications in the same way that the novel, any novel, but your novel can't just be about that moment. It also has to kind of cycle
right.
out.
Well, I think that's
way.
why
Yeah.
when something does stick in our craw and we tell friends to read it, or we say that image stays with us for years, it's because it reaches deep inside of us, and it becomes something about us. It becomes about us. It's not just a picture someone took of some other lady. It's actually a picture in some weird way about us. So I think, yeah, absolutely.
So this is two questions. One is, did you have any qualms or concerns about fictionalizing the lives of real people, particularly in the case of the main character whose image had already been taken, possibly without her permission? And what is the author's responsibility when fictionalizing the lives of real people?
Well, those are fantastic questions, and we've touched a little bit on it. I didn't have qualms in the sense of legal qualms, because we're allowed to do that. And we're not allowed to defame people, but we are allowed to, as fiction writers, or in many of the arts, you can do that. But again, as I said, I had personal qualms about it, and I wanted to make sure that the characters were sort of far enough away from, that I made it very clear to my readers that I was not writing the story of Dorothea Lange and Florence Owens Thompson. And what was the second part?
The second part was, what is the author's responsibility when fictionalizing the lives of real people?
I don't know that there is a responsibility, which is going to sound like a terrible thing to say.
Being
but
an author, it's a totally irresponsible.
I think you can do what you want.
Yeah.
I mean, you can. It's like you can do what you want. You can suffer the consequences. I think there are some legal things about defamation, and but I kind of don't. I think that when you're an artist, you have to feel free to do what you want to do in order to make sort of original statements. And I don't think that. I don't think there is there's not a rule book about it. I mean, if I had been, I don't really think that, I don't know that you are responsible. I think if you want to, you can do whatever you want and let the chips fall where they may. But if you want to make a portrait of somebody real, and you have very negative attitude toward them, and you create a portrait that's very unflattering, that's your prerogative, I think.
Well,
do you feel differently?
No, I think actually your only responsibility is to the work.
Yeah.
What is it? There's, well, whatever. I mean, I write nonfiction, so it's a different thing. But I always believe in, there's a New Yorker cartoon where somebody's signing their book, and his mother is saying, "If I'd known you were going to be a writer, I would have been a better parent." So.
I think every writer draws a line. I mean, some people I know write about their families with impunity, and some people don't want to go there because they don't feel comfortable doing that, or they feel more protective, or and I think everybody makes their own choices about that, and that's why all art is different.
But what I was going to say, though, which I wouldn't mind hearing your thoughts on, is it is a matter, I think, of more of your responsibility to the story, right, to the narrative, to what you're writing, as opposed.
Yeah.
Once you start adapting whatever material you're adapting, your responsibility is primarily to the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah, I mean, the responsibility is a funny word, but you're just trying to tell a story that feels true within the world that you've constructed. And knowing that it's a construct, and knowing that it's not, you're not sort of, it's very funny. I got a letter from somebody the other day through my publisher, and it was a woman, she's quite old, and she wrote me a letter, and she said, "I'm very upset because Walker Dodge was my grandfather, and you have, and I said, I made him up." And but but she, I guess somebody named Walker Dodge existed, and it was her grandfather, and I did not portray him correctly. And so, so yeah, my responsibility is within the very closed universe of my imagination to tell as good a story as I can.
Sort of following along some of these lines, why did you change the baby's gender from the real life Mary Coyne to a boy when she was holding a baby girl in the photograph?
I think at the moment that I did change the gender, I didn't think about the gender. I was trying to think about who is that baby in the photograph, and I have no idea. I don't know the answer to that question. I think I just created this story about that baby. The story about the baby, for those of you who have read it, I won't give it away, it's a spoiler. But it's sort of not at all, it's completely invented. And I don't know why. I have no answer for that.
You're stumped. We've stumped you.
We've stumped me.
Okay, well, let's see what we can do. So the next question is, how did Florence Thompson's family respond to the book? And how did the Lange family respond?
I have not heard from anyone, so I don't know. And, I don't know. Somebody wrote, one of Florence Thompson's great-grandsons wrote me a letter, and he asked me to send in the book, and I sent in the book, and I never heard from him again, so I don't know, maybe he didn't like it. And I have not heard from anybody. I think it's pretty clearly fiction. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that anybody could say, wait, you didn't write the story of Dorothea Lange, because I think it's clear that I wasn't trying to write the story of Dorothea Lange, so.
Right. These are all, the next question is also about changing things. Why did you change the name of Porterville to Porter when other towns
that's a good one.
were?
I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
This is so vexing to me. There is a Porterville, right? And Porterville is the town that I used and I went there, and it's up off the 99, but it's a ways off the 99. You take the 99, and then you have to take some long farm road to get to Porterville. And that was the town in my mind that I was using in terms of the crops and in all, I spent a lot of time talking to people about what crops were where in the 1930s. And so I had finally figured it out. These were the crops that were grown, and this is where they were going to be. But then there's a scene in the book where older Mary is taking a bus up to San Francisco, and she can't have gotten off the 99. So I stressed about this so much, and then I thought, wait a minute, this is fiction. I can move that town. So I moved the town over to be by the 99, and I took off the Ville and called it Porter.
There you go. Okay, so I'll ask one more of these, and then we'll see what if you guys have other questions. So this one is, movies say based on a true story and then change the facts. You seem to have done something the same as all these people lived other lives. Why did you use that format? But this may be a broader question of what we've been talking about in general.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of what we were talking about. I certainly loved and was very moved by a lot of the facts that I could find about the real lives, especially Dorothea Lange. Her life was ripe with wonderful event and wonderful human situation, and in fact she did have her two sons fostered out during the Depression, and there was just a lot that happened in her life that was just wonderful stuff to explore. So that's why I did it. But I think that part of what's powerful to me in fiction is having certain, when a book ends or a story ends, what I like to feel, so I guess this is what I try to do, is I like to feel like certain things have wrapped up, but certain questions have suddenly been asked. And that when I close the book, I'm still asking those questions, and I'm compelled within my heart to think and read and muse. And that's the great feeling of I get when I finish a book that I like, is that I'm left with things to think about. So part of my goal is to not wrap it all up in a tidy bow, but to sort of say these questions that are left open are not simply about character, but as David said, they're about bigger things.
And that seems like a perfect place actually to wrap it up with a tidy bow.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure. I really appreciate it.